Welcome. This is the second of our First Friday forums that the League sponsors yearly, and we do it throughout the year. We are at, as you know, at the Community Center. We have assisted listening devices for anyone who might need them over there. And I'm Margaret Copey, I'm the convener. And today's forum was arranged by Eileen Zalisk, who's on the board. And so I'm going to turn it over to her and let her finish the introductions.
Thank you, Margaret. And we're very pleased today to have District Attorney Marian Ryan. Across the country and in our state, there has been new understanding of the importance of local and statewide elected officials in shaping government and preserving democracy. This is especially true of the Office of District Attorney here in Massachusetts and also across the land. Today, the League of Women Voters Lexington First Friday program introduces someone most of us, many of us know, and is very important in our community, Middlesex District Attorney Marian Ryan, and highlights her important work serving the largest county in New England, and we are the largest county in New England, covering 54 cities and towns. The office represents Massachusetts in many cases in 11 or 12. It's kind of confusing. District courts for juvenile.
Could you speak right into the...
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. 4 juvenile courts and 2 superior courts located throughout the country. Attorney Marian Ryan is well known for her innovative work in confronting racial injustice, reducing unfair judicial practices, addressing the opioid crisis, supporting immigration, and pioneering restorative justice, the whole idea of restorative justice, among her many priorities and accomplishments. During her tenure, the DA's office has created many of the best-in-class crime prevention programs, as well as a cold case unit that has delivered justice and answers in decades-old crimes. But recently, DA Marian Ryan has been also interested and set out to confront one of the most challenging problems of our time, the rise of disinformation and misinformation, and the challenge to young and old to fact-check information and differentiate between truth and falsehood. And this is a quote from Marian Ryan, "If we lose the ability to accept objective facts," she said, "it eats away at our democracy." District Attorney Ryan grew up in Somerville and is a summa cum laude graduate of Emmanuel College and a cum laude graduate of Boston College Law School. District Attorney Marian Ryan is a career prosecutor and with significant courtroom experience. She was elected to office in Middlesex County District Attorney in 2014 and was re-elected in the election of November 2018. From her experience, she's learned that as important as a prosecutor's job is, prevention is equally important and leads to better outcomes. So at this very difficult time in our country's history especially, we're really pleased to have District Attorney Marian Ryan here to speak today.
Thank you, Eileen and Margaret, and thank you all for having me here today. As I said a little bit earlier, as I appear in the 54 cities and towns, it unfortunately is usually when something bad has happened. So I'm always happy to come someplace to talk about the amazing work that the folks in our office do when there's nothing bad on the horizon. But if you'll indulge me for a second, I want to step back for a minute and I think give you a couple of illustrations that really show how the role of district attorney has changed. You know, I like to consider myself sort of a student of politics across many realms. And I see that as sort of 3 realms. We obviously have the international realm, we have the national, and we have the local. And if you think about the top 2 right now, I think what we've certainly seen over the last couple of years maybe is a lot of chaos. We have right now, when you think about the global situation, the largest land war since World War II going on in Europe. We've had the terrible attacks by terrorists in the Middle East. We've got here in our own country up until last week, literally the complete inability to elect a speaker, and never mind getting any legislation passed or really actually moving forward. We've got a Supreme Court that is at best ethically challenged and seems to be just making its own rules and going its own way. And the really interesting piece about all of that is that none of that is naturally occurring. It is happening because of agents of chaos. Whether it is, Putin, President Xi, whether it is MAGA Republicans, all of those groups, and they're not all morally equal, but they all are agents of chaos who are acting to disrupt things. And they are not just doing that, they are benefiting because of it. Because their chaos
Kelsey, call the front desk, please. Kelsey.
distracts us from other things. It lets them take over territories. It lets them win elections. It lets them advance their agendas. And at the same time that that's all going on, I don't know about you, but I know last week, even with, our phones in our pocket, we've probably never had access to more information more quickly than we do now. And yet it's almost impossible to keep up. I was going out to speak at an event last week when the latest sacrificial lamb, Tom Emmer, was being popped up. And I heard that he was there, and by the time I drove to the event, he had withdrawn. Like, it's just hard to keep up with all of that, right? And then you add on top of that the people who are purposely putting bad information out, and you can see how easy it is to be part of that chaos. And I think what is really striking and what is important for us to remember here is that in Massachusetts, when we look at the local level, we really have bucked that trend. When you look at the people that we have in places of power in government here in Massachusetts, we really have folks who work together well, who are intending to be agents of competence and get things done and make information available to people. And that is really a dramatic change from the rest of the country. And then you look at that statistic that came out last week. I find this just shocking because I am going to be the last person clutching the paper edition of the Globe getting my information. But 42% of Americans now do not read the news. Like, that's pretty scary. And even when you're trying to keep up, you can't keep up. If you are, as many of them said in that survey, not only do they not read, watch, or otherwise keep up, they actively avoid getting information. They find it just all too distressing and too hard, so they don't do anything. Well, then when you couple that with the importance of elections, of decisions we make, we're not going to have a well-informed citizenry making those determinations. And I want to just give you, I didn't intend to have this happen, obviously, but I want to just give you an example of a couple of things we've been dealing with over the last few days as to how those agents of chaos disrupt our system. So the day before yesterday, today's Friday, yeah, Wednesday, we had one of our communities has one of those neighborhood blog kind of things, it's the town and you can go on and see when the trash will be picked up and all of that sort of thing. And somebody began spreading information on that blog that the police had done something which was completely untrue. It wasn't a distortion of one event, it was literally a made-up situation. And in response to this made-up information, people began announcing what action they intended to take against the police department. And that included going to the police department and shooting up the police department. All right, this is 5 days after Lewiston. And the plan to go the next day, which was yesterday, to various courthouses to cause as much chaos as possible. And some people felt the need, to go on this website and start announcing the names of certain officers as well as their children, the officers' children. and to be targets for the ire that people had about the completely made-up information that was on there. Well, after working through the night on Wednesday, we were able to identify the person who had started that information and to arrest that person for the threats that they had put out and all of that. And they were in court yesterday, so that case is moving on. But meanwhile, yesterday, we at the Superior Court were having a jury waived trial on part of a murder case. We had a murder case where the defendant had pled guilty to the underlying facts of the killing, but there's a serious mental health issue. So before somebody can be committed, after they've been found guilty, be committed for mental health treatment, you have to have another hearing where the doctors testify. So we were doing that hearing, the doctors were testifying, everything was going along fine, when we had 3 individuals from the gallery rush at the defendant to physically attack him. Of course, the court officers kind of jumped into action to prevent him, because you don't know what they might have as they're going at that. Well, we had a court officer who went through the wall, literally through the wall, who suffered some injuries. We've got another, oh, thank you. We have another court officer with a broken hand. We have people truly terrorized. The proceeding obviously couldn't go forward. And just think about sort of the fear that this engenders in this particular week in the room next door to where this was all unfolding, and literally somebody was going through the wall. We had a jury on another murder case that was deliberating. So when a jury's deliberating, you know, if you've ever been on a jury, they are locked into the jury room, and the room is blocked with the stick, the mace, so that no one can enter that jury room. Well, they're in there, and they can hear everything that's happening next door, all of this commotion and running and people coming from all through the building. They believed, and one of them actually knew about the posting from the day before to attack the courthouses because they lived in that community. So now they believe there's an active shooter situation going on. So they call 911 from the jury room. So we have, on one floor, we have the court officers and the police who are in the courtroom trying to restore order and arrest the people who've jumped on the defendant in that case. We have a group locked up in the jury room who's terrified, and not unreasonably, given the world we live in. And then we have the Woburn Police Department storming into the building, you know, ready to deal with an active shooter. But that's the kind of disruption and chaos that never happened. And when you sort of peel back all those layers, the information that was out there about go to the courthouses, people seeing that, you know, that is a real challenge to the rule of law. Because if we can't bring people together to have a trial, have juries return verdicts, you know, every time, if you've been in a courtroom, you know, it's like this room. You have the family of the victim on one side and the family of the defendant on the other, and the jury comes back with a verdict. One side or the other is unhappy. And if we can't do that in a reasonable way, we can't be a very viable democracy. And, you know, so that last 36, 48 hours has been pretty sobering in terms of what's going on here. And it is in part what people see out there, what they read, what they take up as completely valid. In the meantime, this week, we've been dealing over in Cambridge, and some of you have probably seen this, there's a media group that's been sending trucks through the city, doxing students who signed some of the petitions in supporting Palestine or supporting Israel, whatever it was, and they've got different trucks and they're all over Cambridge. Well, everybody's got a right to free speech and you have a right to protest, and that's all fine. And so that's been relatively uneventful. In fact, it's been so uneventful that that apparently wasn't satisfactory. So on Monday, those companies decided that they would up the ante a little bit by going actually to the homes of the people who had signed them with the doxing truck. And if you haven't seen these trucks, they're pretty big. They're sort of the size of the U-Haul, the decent size U-Haul that you might do if you were emptying out an apartment. And on the sides of the truck, it's that kind of flipping media sign, and it actually shows someone's picture. And beside it, it tells their name, their address, some information about them. And they were parking them in front of people's homes. Needless to say, that didn't go so well. So many of the people that they were targeting are professors at different universities, a lot of whom lived in apartment buildings along Memorial Drive. So we had these trucks pulling up, outside Professor X's home, and clearly they're there, they're very bright, they're very flashy, they're there to attract attention. And in about 10 minutes from some of these buildings, we had bricks raining down from up above. So we, number one, had the college kids or whoever it was who'd been hired to drive these trucks, for a couple of $100. Well, when bricks started coming off the windshield, they weren't really interested anymore. So they're trying to get away. We've got people walking on the sidewalk. Meanwhile, we've got bricks flying down from up above. And, that's a difference between your protesting and now we've gotten to a different place. So, and we've got that battle which is going on with memes and other things on social media about what this is really all about. So that's a whole different world. It's a whole different world of what we're prosecuting in terms of those kinds of crimes and the reactions that they're provoking and the violence that's being provoked. So that is just a few days of how very different this job has become. And that has really what led us to one of our newest initiatives is we've really been looking at, particularly for young people, how they can become better consumers of information. Because we spend a lot of time, we have some youth councils, I spend a lot of time out at the Y and places like that talking to kids, and you hear the things they say, which are really not fact-based, but they've picked up somewhere. Or we see, and this is a sort of intersectionality of different challenges. We have right now a lot of young people, well, a lot of people, but a lot of young people struggling with mental health issues. They're struggling with mental health issues and they're going down this rabbit hole of misinformation. And the result is not very good. So we partnered with Stanford University and a think tank they have about being good digital citizens, and have developed a digital citizenship academy for kids. And we're going to use that for seniors as well because they're at the other end really being taken advantage of by that information. But the program really is we go out into the community. We are happy to go to any kind of group. So if you know a group of young people, whether it's like a scouting group or a church group or the Good Government Club at the high school, whatever that is. And we spend about an hour and a half with the kids going through and showing them different things that they might see online and how valid something might look. But really how to be a person who reads horizontally. So when they look and they see a website, are they on a separate screen opening that up and figuring out who's putting that information out there? Really is pretty amazing to see. They're so digitally native anyway, they get to it very quickly, but they're shocked to discover like what it means when something says it's sponsored, or whose point of view is being reflected in what's being shown there, and how that should change what they think about what they see. The research that Stanford has conducted on this curriculum that we purchased for them shows that just doing that program makes kids 80% more likely to be able to pick out bad information. And when you think about, we're encouraging people now to be registering to vote, pre-register at 16. If they're the same people who don't know how to sort out that information, that's really a problem. And then we're using it as well at the other end for older citizens, because I think if anything, the pandemic made people have more access to digital information. People got much more used to that. And it has now become, we've always had terrible scams and ways that people are manipulated online. That has just grown exponentially in terms of what we're seeing for people losing money. You might have seen, just yesterday, we had a individual up in Chelmsford that lost $100,000. And as I say all the time, we prosecute a lot of those cases. We are successful in tracking the person down. We prosecute them, we get a good disposition. We virtually never get the money back. The money's gone. And either because they've passed it on, they were sort of a middleman, or they quickly got rid of the money. So that changes people's lives if they can't get that money back. So we're really looking to make that better. You know, we talk about the romance scams and all of those things. A lot of that is not being able to sort out the kind of information that you're seeing, and it's leading people to send just literally tens of thousands of dollars on a routine basis to people that are just there as a way to get money. So that whole digital citizenship, I'm really looking for people to help us with that, to get that word out, to run other programs, trainings. It's a pretty fascinating thing to look at something. When Stanford came to do the training for us, and I wouldn't say I'm an intellectual wizard and digital wizard, but I thought I had a pretty good grasp. And then you look at it and you realize who's behind some of that information. It's very scary. And it's very easy to make it look good and to think about that piece of what people are ingesting. And especially complicated by the fact that we've got a lot of people who are very isolated and who are suffering from some mental health issues. I want to turn to some of the other interesting things that are different. And, you know, I think for a long time, and probably what people really think about DA's offices, and certainly when I started in the office, this is what we did. We pretty much were there to prosecute the cases that the police brought to us. We opened the doors in the morning, they brought the cases in, we prosecuted them, and off we went. And we started over again every morning. And you aren't doing that for very long before you realize that when you are, A, prosecuting the same people over and over again, or as I did this for a while, you start prosecuting the children and even the grandchildren of people you prosecuted before, it's not exactly a success. And we needed to be doing things very differently. And one of the things that we've tried to do in our office is really divide things sort of into three categories. The first is really the prosecution of those kind of violent cases, the violent behavior that we just cannot have. And obviously at the top of that list are the homicide cases that we have. And when you have a homicide, when somebody comes into one of our communities and takes somebody's life, you really cannot leave that unaddressed. You cannot. And you know, we have been very fortunate in terms of the partnerships we've built and with law enforcement, with our state police. We're at 100% clearance rate on our homicide cases. So we have a homicide, we have people being charged in that case. That is something that changes the dynamic. It ups the ante for people who are thinking they want to come here to do something. You know, there's a piece of the cases that are going to always happen where they happen. A domestic case is going to happen in that house. But for the people who are coming in, who are doing a drug case, who are doing some kind of gang issue, when you're looking at a place where you see people get arrested, they get charged, it's easier to go somewhere else. So that's an important piece. The other side of that is, one of the things that you see, especially over time, is that for people who lose somebody to violence, that is a shadow that falls over a family for generations. And it really is a piece of what I feel strongly about our commitment to those cases that haven't been charged. You know, those murders that happened 30 or 40 years ago. You see them on TV once in a while and everybody's still wondering what happened. I prosecuted a case myself about 7 or 8 years ago that I had had for 21 years. I had responded to the initial call. It was the mother of 3 young children who had been murdered in her own home. We always had a suspect or an idea of who might have been responsible, but we couldn't get enough evidence to be able to charge that person. And we worked on it using a number of new techniques over 21 years and ultimately charged someone. I prosecuted that case. He was convicted of first-degree murder. His conviction was upheld at the Supreme Judicial Court. But aside from the case, it gave me a window into seeing what happened to those 3 children. They were 4, 7, and 11 when their mother was killed. And yes, we all kind of know, gee, I wonder what happens to those kids. But this was because we were in contact with them all those years, seeing how different their life was. You know, the 4-year-old had some behavioral issues. He went into the custody of the Department of Children and Families. And the department works hard, but no child is better off being in custody there and moving from foster home to foster home. He is a young man today who is not the person he would have been had he been raised with his own family. The 7-year-old, who probably fared best of anyone, was adopted by his first grade teacher, and which was wonderful, and he had a good home, but very shortly after he was adopted, the father in that family was transferred, and they moved far away. So he went with that family, but had no real contact with his own birth family. And the oldest daughter, who to this day, I think, thinks about, could she have gotten home sooner that day from school, or maybe prevented what happened? She was taken in by some relatives, largely as a babysitter caretaker for everybody's kids, and sort of couch surfed from place to place. And with an incredible resilience, managed to get herself through college, is married, has a child of her own now, but spent many, many years thinking, despite the fact that we were working very hard on that case, that because her mother was a single mother who lived in public housing, that no one cared. And when we brought those kids together to tell them that we had made an arrest, that was the first time they'd been in the same room since their mother's funeral, 21 years before. And you know, I'd always known how difficult it was to have an uncharged case, but I saw it there. I saw how it changed those people's lives. So we've made an enormous commitment in our office to clearing all of those old cases. And you may have seen, we just recently charged in a 50-year-old murder out of Bedford. We just got a conviction about a month and a half ago on a 31-year-old case of the murder of a 16-year-old girl in Malden. That girl was 16 years old. She was in DCF custody, placed in a foster home. She was sitting on the fire escape of the apartment on a hot night and was shot through the head. And you know what? Really, there wasn't a lot of family to be knocking on our door every week. I mean, she'd been taken away from her own family. They were dispersed. The family that she'd been placed with was connected to the person who ultimately got convicted of the murder, so they certainly weren't knocking at our door. But you couldn't leave that unresolved. And we were able to use a lot of the new technology to be able to look at evidence that maybe didn't mean so much years ago. And I was very struck by it because it happened a week before my oldest child was born. And my oldest child has lived his whole life of over 30 years while that girl's murder went unaddressed, until we did that conviction. We have 4 other cases where we've exhumed bodies, been able to use evidence differently, and make that charging call. We've brought onto our staff what I think is going to be really a game-changing piece, which is the use of forensic genealogy. We have a forensic genealogist on staff now, one of the best in the world, helping us with those cases. Because I think one of the things that people don't think about is, you know, DNA and fingerprints and all those things are great, but they only work if the person is already in the system somewhere. So if I come, as we did, we just charged in a 21-year-old sexual assault that happened in Cambridge. Parents had their 13-year-old daughter go to bed. They went to bed down the hall. Everybody was asleep. Suddenly the daughter woke up and there was a strange man in her room. Sexually assaulted her. She's screaming for her parents. Parents, you know, are waking up, running into the hall. He runs out of the house. We got lots of forensic evidence in that house. We got fingerprints. We got some DNA. It happened to be that individual's first crime. We didn't find him in the system. So you can run that DNA forever. There's not going to be any match. What forensic genealogy allows you to do is to use it as an investigative lead to see if there's anybody who is genetically related to the person you are looking for. So in that case, we were able to find somebody in the system who was genetically connected to that person. And then you have to, it's a tedious process, because I may find your 4th cousin in there, all right? Now you might have 26 cousins. Some of them are female, some of them are dead, some of them live across the world, and we're kind of building a family tree and working down to who is a potential target. And even when we get to that, you then have to build out, was that person in a place where this could have happened? Do they fit a description you have? Can you build a case against them? And then do you ultimately have enough to ask a judge for a DNA or a fingerprint sample for them, which, if you're right, should match what you took from the scene of the crime? And that's what we were able to do, is build that case backwards to get to the person who, unfortunately, now has committed a number of other crimes, so is in the system now, but somebody always has a first crime, or they have a crime where they haven't gone into the system. So that whole piece is really a focus for us about the kind of violence and danger that people cannot tolerate in their community, and the commitment we have to families who lose someone, that we will not give up on working on those cases. But that's a really small percentage of our cases. The much bigger issue for us is looking at what can we learn from what happens about how we prevent things. And so in that case I talked about, where the mother was murdered with the 3 children, she was murdered by someone who was a coworker. And it was a coworker who wanted to be in a romantic relationship with her. And she was friendly and outgoing and pleasant, really happy to have her job, because she had a job that allowed her to work in a way she could take care of the kids. She had finally gotten her family out of a situation where they were in a shelter. That job was allowing her to pay the rent. And she was, even though she was put off by the way he was behaving to her, she didn't want to lose her job. He was very senior to her in the company. She was at the bottom of the totem pole. So she wasn't looking to rock that boat and maybe lose her job. And what we learned from that was, first of all, how much behavior can be tolerated. More importantly, how information gets siloed. She had mentioned to certain people the things that were happening. People had seen things that weren't quite right. He was appearing at her job site. He was, focusing too much on her. People had seen that, but we all know this. You see something, you think that's a little bit odd, but you only know that one slice of the story, and you don't put that all together. After she was killed, and after we had the focus on him, it was a family-owned business, and the owner of the business, who took this very seriously, said, "This really all happened on my watch. Everybody here knew a piece of information, and we didn't have a way to integrate that. We didn't have a way to make sure she knew that we would protect her. We wouldn't have fired her, we wouldn't have done different things." And from that, he helped us to create our workplace safety program, which is a program that we take across the county, really tailored to different workplaces. For instance, last week I was out at a large real estate office, because we've developed a piece of that program which is for realtors. Realtors are at a lot of risk when they're out showing houses. We've had a number of cases, particularly in new developments. If you're an agent showing a house in a new development, and they're expensive homes in most towns in our county, you want to sell that house, and someone says, "I work, can I meet you at that house at 7 o'clock tonight?" You're going to say, "Sure, I'll be there." There's nobody around, because the workmen have all gone home. People aren't living in those other houses yet. We've had over a half dozen very serious assaults that have happened there because of that situation. So we've built this program to really educate realtors on how to help themselves, how to not have, as a realtor told me last week, he was showing an apartment to someone, and it was fine, the person had come, they were showing it, and suddenly, very expensive apartment, suddenly the person said, "I have a couple of friends outside who also want to look." Well, he suddenly opens the door, and 2 big guys suddenly come in. Now it's 3-on-1. And he said, "I didn't want to give up this commission. I was really scared. They were between the door and me." And he was lucky. He got a phone call. He managed to step out to take the phone call, managed to kind of diffuse the situation. Those are important things to be educating people about. We've spent a lot of time at hospitals. We've had a number of very violent episodes in hospitals across our county. I spend a lot of time with mass nurses. 90% of nurses in our county, and it's true across the state, report having been assaulted at work. People are getting bad news. They're often not at their best. the family is maybe fighting with each other and then they get some other piece of information. We had an incident just a month ago at the Mount Auburn Hospital. 2 employees of the hospital incredibly badly injured in the emergency room. You know, they don't know who's coming through the emergency room door. They don't know what they're bringing with them. They don't know who else is coming in. And what we discovered, and it's very interesting, some of the things we've learned, and you'll see this if you are in medical facilities or hospitals as it unfolds over time. One of the places we discovered was the most dangerous for staff was the ICU. And if you've ever been in an ICU, you know it's designed for patient care, and there's usually a circle of rooms, and there's a desk in the middle. There's one way in and one way out. If somebody blocks that one way in and one way out, no one's going anywhere. The rooms are all open in glass, so they can see everybody at once. But if a dangerous situation's unfolding and you're trying to seek cover, there's nowhere to seek cover. So in that work, we've done lots with hospital administrators about thinking, how do you make that safer? That's real prevention. I'm always happy to meet people, but it's better if I never meet you as the victim of something that's happened. You know, the same is true with respect to thinking about how do we get kids who arrive in our juvenile system or in our criminal justice system. And we know a piece of that is kids who don't do well in school, kids who are not progressing in their education. Where do they end up? One of the things that I've been very concerned about, and we've done a lot of work with our communities around, is the absentee rate. Our absentee rate in school is just astronomical. In some of our communities, it's at 40% for young kids. And I'm not talking about the 15-year-old who skipped school. I'm talking about the 2nd or 3rd grader who's missing 30 or 40 days of school. Think about what that means, right? Because then when they do come to school, they're not doing well. And when you're that little, it's pretty easy to figure out what is the good group and what is the group that's not doing so well. Now they don't want to go to school. Now they're falling behind. Maybe they're going to repeat and they're separated from their friends. And the next thing you know, they're old enough not to go to school. So one of our challenges has been, how do we address that? How do we address that attendance piece? How do we address the kids who are being suspended? You know, when you suspend a 3rd grader, I'm always afraid of that because, first of all, they're out of school and they're probably pretty vulnerable. And most of them aren't spending the day at home with mom on the couch with milk and cookies. They're out somewhere where they're likely to get into some other trouble, or they're home alone on their phone or getting into something else. And one of the things that we discovered, and I know this is sort of beyond what people think about for DA's offices, but we discovered that over 80% of the kids in the younger grades who were being disciplined were not receiving any routine dental care. So it's like, what do you do with those 2 pieces? But I suggest, think about this. If you've ever had a toothache or a problem with your teeth, you're not eating very well. You're probably not sleeping all that well. And you're certainly not following directions and getting along well. And what does that translate to the child who's just disruptive in school? So we began a program about 4 years ago, just before the pandemic, partnering with our colleges and universities that offer dental hygienist programs and with the dental schools, where we now have targeted communities where those students, right, they're dental hygienist students, they actually need people whose teeth they want to clean and who they want to put fluoride on. They're looking in their friends and family to get that. We're sending them out to schools in our community to 2nd and 5th grade, allowing the parents to opt in with their kids, get their teeth cleaned, get the fluoride put on them so they don't develop those cavities, and when they need more advanced dental work, partnering with the dentists who've agreed to be in that program. We know that's prevention. It's not what people think about as prevention, but we're making those kids healthier. And it's fun because when the kids go, they do a whole lesson with those students about oral hygiene, about how do you drink milk instead of soda, all of those kinds of things that are healthier. The better we can make kids, the less likely we are to see them at the other end. Then when you look at why they're not going to school, I think one of the things we've seen is we are very resource rich here in this state. Schools have lots of programs, but every program doesn't fit every kid. And what is making little Johnny not come to school is not necessarily the same thing that's making little Susie not come to school. And I really wanted a way to be able to think less systemically and more individually. And the partner that we found to help us with that, and I think this really sums up who the kids are who we don't see in the criminal justice system, is Boston College has a Center for the Thriving Child. Thriving children are not in the criminal justice system. The founder of that program, the PhD founder of that program, has partnered with us to help us create programs in school where there is a designated individual to take the child who's not doing well in school and say, here is Johnny. What's the problem with him? Does he not have boots to come in the winter? Does he lack transportation to get here? There's an enormous number of kids who don't have transportation to get to school. We think we've got them covered. We don't necessarily, especially in some of our communities. Are they a person who has to act as a translator for their parents? So the parents keep them out of school to go to medical appointments? And then what can we do individually for that child to get that child in school and get them moving towards success? We've just gotten a $100,000 grant from the Executive Office of Public Safety to help us implement that program. We've targeted 4 of our communities where the absentee rate is the highest. And the Center for the Thriving Child, which has taken its program across the world, its greatest success has been in Dublin, has really seen a change with kids. You know, kids are not widgets. We can't put the same program in place and think it's going to fix every kid. This is that personal, warm handoff of this child needs this, and I am connecting them with that. That's the kind of bigger prevention that we are looking to do, more systemic in terms of where we're going with all of that. And then the other piece of what we look at, and I'm happy to talk about some of the other programs that target different problems, different issues. I've been in Lexington, for instance, with our program, our Cut It Out program. We've partnered with hair salons and with schools, the vocational schools, because, for instance, we know that domestic violence, which affects every one of our 54 communities, it lives in different kinds of houses, but it's happening in every community. Many times there are reasons, whether it be shame, status, fear, that people aren't telling anybody about what's going on in their own house. But one group of people that they do tend to share with is their personal care folks, their hairdresser, their manicurist. And why? Everybody laughs, right? Because, and every woman in here knows that you have been at the hairdressers and heard people telling people things that you think, really? You're sharing that? But there is also a bigger piece of it, 2 bigger pieces. One is, there are injuries. I've been a prosecutor for a long time. There are injuries that you only see in a domestic violence case, in no other kind of crime. So, for instance, one of the most common injuries in serious domestic violence cases is someone pulls out clumps of your hair, and they pull them out at the back of your hairline, right? It's incredibly painful. If I'm holding you by the back of your head, you're getting the message that I'm in charge of you. It is also, remember, I don't want to get caught. It's an injury that it's pretty easy to cover up. Because if I've got a clump of hair missing on the nape of my neck, you can't really tell that. But your hairdresser sees that. Another injury that you really only see in domestic violence cases is attempts to strangle people. Nobody robs a store by strangling somebody. Almost all serious domestic violence cases involve strangulation. So you've got those fingerprint marks on your throat. You maybe have the tiny little petechia in your eye. Well, we live in a place where it's cold half the year. So if I have a turtleneck on or I've got a scarf wrapped around my neck, you don't see any of those injuries. But when I go to get my hair cut and I put that smock on, they see those finger marks. And I think this is the most interesting part. I brought this program to Middlesex in 2009. It took me a long time to think about this. I think if any one of us had to stand up and share some incredibly personal, embarrassing detail, we would normally not want to do that, right? You wouldn't want to tell anybody, you don't want to share that. But one of the things that people, I think, most think about is what's going to be the look on the person's face that you're telling. Are they going to be disgusted? Are they going to be angry? Is it your mother who says, I never liked him anyway? Like, what's going to be that reaction, right? Now, think about when you are at a salon. First of all, it's probably one of the few times in the whole day where you have a person, right? All day long today, we will talk to all kinds of people. Some of them will love us, some of whom we're buying something from, whatever it is. Most of them will be doing something else while they're talking to us. So you don't have people's full attention. And if you think about the setting in a salon, the person's usually behind you. They're very close to you, but they're behind you. So you can tell them something, you don't have to be watching their face. It is a setting that is perfect for the intimacy of disclosing those kind of details. I have never gone to a salon and talked about this and not had individuals who work there come up afterwards and say, I have a client that I've been worried about forever. I've asked, I've seen things, maybe they've even told me something, and I don't know where to send them. So we do this program with our local police so that instead of somebody saying, you know, you could call the police, they can say, you know, Detective so-and-so, they are somebody you can talk to. That's another kind of prevention that gets into these partnerships with our community. There are so many things, whether it's the opioid crisis or domestic violence, they're not just law enforcement issues. Our opioid task force, you know, this county in 2012 was incredibly hard hit with the opioid crisis. It was not a situation that the police or law enforcement could solve alone. We began a task force seated at our hospitals across the county because it is a public health issue. Those task forces have met once a month since 2012, even during the pandemic, virtually. It has led to what is completely different in this county. Last month, and it has been month to month, except for about a 2-month blip during the pandemic, we had an 18% decline in fatal opioid overdoses. That is in contrast to what the rest of the state has seen. And I would suggest to you that's because of partnership. We've brought a lot of stakeholders together and really attacked this problem from all different pieces. We've looked at what are the services, how can we distribute Narcan, how can we distribute test strips, how can we help people with kids that are born with substance involved. All of those pieces help us to know better about who's at risk and how do we best use our resources. We, as I said before, we are very resource rich here. It is a question of how we use those resources for maximum impact. 18% is not 100%, but when you think about when someone dies from an overdose, it isn't just that person, it's their whole circle. And even if that circle is 10 people, that's a pretty small circle, that's hundreds of people who, because of those efforts, don't suffer that loss. That's work that's very worth doing. And then the third piece that we try to take to our experience to, in addition to the prevention and intervention, is how can we change on a policy level? And I see Representative Sokola has joined us. We are very fortunate in this county to have an incredibly cooperative and collaborative delegation where we've been able to take what we see in cases and use that to build out the law. So for instance, I talked about our Cut It Out program. We now have a piece of legislation, which I testified on last week, that just made it out of committee, that would require that anyone in Massachusetts who gets a personal care license get an hour of that training before they get the license. So that's taking something from what we've seen in cases, building it into a program, and then making that a statewide piece. We've been able to do that in terms of some of the things that we discover really need to be addressed. So for instance, you probably think that if I drove around Lexington and I was just firing a gun at will out the window, shooting randomly, and I didn't actually hit someone, that there is an appropriate crime for that. But there isn't. All right, so we have filed a piece of legislation after we had a OK Corral shootout that went down Memorial Drive at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, where a group of cars was just shooting at each other. Fortunately, they were bad shots, so they didn't hit anybody, but they terrorized the neighborhood. So that's led to a piece of legislation that we are advancing with respect to that. It also is the case that we see in some of our communities that firing, and you've seen some of these on the news, firing at people's houses is a pretty effective way to silence folks. So I have a grudge against you, or I think you might be going to the police against me. I just drive around and I shoot into your house. We've been incredibly fortunate, the people who've been hit in those instances, it's been very minor. But think about putting your child to bed and having a bullet come in over their bed. We've had that. We've had people sleeping on the couch and had a bullet come into the couch. That is not right now in Massachusetts a crime that can be appropriately punished. But yet, if you go up to Lowell, there are many, many intersections where when you come to the four-way intersection, 3 of those houses have bullet holes in them. I can tell you people who have an opportunity to leave that town and that happens to their house, they're gone. So what does that mean for a community? So we've advanced that piece of legislation. You've heard lots of talk about what we now see. We arrested somebody with one just last night, the presence of these ghost guns. You know, a ghost gun it sounds less dangerous than it is. It is literally a gun where somebody who almost by definition should not have a gun. They're either too young, they have a mental health situation, they've been arrested and convicted of something else. They send away on the handy internet and they get a kit which contains 80% of a gun. They then use their 3D printer and they print the remaining 20% of the pieces. Takes less than a half an hour to put it together. The first ghost gun I ever saw was put together by a 13-year-old. He and his 7-year-old sister were out in the back of the house in a very nice residential community doing target practice. So there are a number of problems. First of all, they are completely untraceable. So when somebody commits a crime with one, they can leave it right there. There's absolutely nothing we can do with it. It has no serial number. We can't figure out who bought it. We can't figure out where it came from. The other piece, which many people don't realize until their dismay, it acts upon them, because those, you know, when you shoot a gun, there's an explosion inside. Because you're manufacturing those parts from plastic, they blow apart eventually. So we had a murder in Woburn where the gun blew apart in the hand of the person who was shooting it. So it's dangerous to the person who's using it as well as to the person they use it against. The bullet from that gun that blew apart, unfortunately, hit the individual. It did its job. But then the person, when he went to fire the gun the second time, the gun blew apart in his hand. So we arrived to discover a pile of brightly colored pieces of plastic that were the remnants of the ghost gun. We executed a search warrant recently on an individual, a very well-heeled individual with a nice job and a nice house, and we executed that search warrant about 9 o'clock in the morning. He and his wife were at work, the children were at school, and in the children's bedroom, the directions for the ghost gun. So what you do is you go in your computer, you get the directions for the ghost gun, and you hook it up to the printer. And sitting in the children's bedroom, the printer was just running, kicking out the guns that were in the tray in the bottom. There's no need for anybody to have those. By definition, if you have one, you can't have a legitimate gun. That's been a big piece of the legislation that the legislature is working on in terms of how people can have guns, we can respect people's Second Amendment rights. There are guns that should not be out there. One of the other pieces is there is a thing called a bump stock, which is a part you buy and you put it on a gun. And a regular gun, so say you have a revolver, and you put the bump stock on it, that gun now fires automatically. It will just continue to fire. To give you an example, when we have kind of a shootout on the street, we used to go to those, we'd find 9, 12 spent casings. We had a shootout this weekend where we found 146 casings. That's because the guns have bumped up. That's how many of these mass shootings happen, because they can just keep firing the gun. You don't have to click and re-click the way you would without that. So that's something people should not be able to buy. And yet, technology has gotten ahead of the law. That's why this really sweeping change around the gun laws is so important, because it's going to address so many of those things. It's also true with respect to our devices. You know, the law has not kept up at the pace that technology has changed. So the way that I can send text or messages or all of those, or how we collect those for evidence, the law hasn't really kept up with that. There's a lot of legislation this session that deals with revenge porn. You know, the ability of somebody you might have been in a relationship with, you shared some inappropriate pictures, you broke up, they're now sharing them with your grandmother or with your boss. Well, the law hasn't really kept up with that. Or the situation where people are grooming kids for sexual abuse by asking them to send pictures. We have some statutes that deal with that, but it doesn't really address where we are with how people can get information. So we spend a lot of our time, about every session we file about 25 pieces of legislation, looking both at what we've seen as things that may be missing in the statute or new crimes that people come to us. I will tell you, and I'll end with this, one piece of legislation that I'm working very hard on this session, and we've seen it all over the place, has to do with medical fraud and assault on patients. So, for instance, you go to a doctor, and particularly it's been true with OBGYNs and orthopedists. You go to the doctor, you have some problem. You're going to the doctor because they're an expert. The doctor tells you, I need to do X, or I need you to perform some act in front of me so I can assess your problem, whatever it is. Well, most people are going to do that, right? They really want to get their problem solved. If what is happening to you is inappropriate sexual touching, and you then, sometimes you realize it right then, but you don't know what to do. Many of those physicians who are doing that are already violating the best practice. They don't have a chaperone in the room with them. You know, they don't have that nurse or somebody else. But there aren't a lot of people. You know, you're not at your best when you're in a paper Johnny lying on a table. Most people are not running out into the hallway saying, stop, stop. It's when they go home and they realize that wasn't really appropriate. Or, for instance, with orthopedists, we've had a lot of young people who, and this is the scenario that is really sad, and you can see how it happens, they're athletes. They've been injured. All they care about is getting back to playing. So they go to a doctor, and the doctor's saying, I need you to do this, or let me touch you here, or whatever. They'll do anything, because they just want to be cleared to go back to play. Or maybe they've never been to the OBGYN before. They're not really sure what's supposed to happen. So their trust is violated there. What happens now is they come to us. They tell us what's happened. We can't prosecute that. Because in order to charge somebody, for instance, with a rape, the touching has to be unconsented to. You consented to that touching. Mistakenly or ill-informed, you consented to it. But the Supreme Judicial Court's been clear, consent is consent. And they have said the legislature needs to carve out a piece that says when a medical professional does it by fraud to get your consent, we can punish that. You've probably seen the whole episode that's unfolded over the last few weeks at the Faulkner and the Brigham and all of that. That's all of a piece. So this piece of legislation would create that exception. Even though you consented because the doctor told you, I need this, this will make you better, whatever it is, and we will still be able to prosecute that. So it doesn't double the betrayal. So those are really the three big pieces that we are looking at. It's that prosecution piece, it's the intervention and prevention, and then it is the legislative, which is the larger impact. So I know that's a lot of information, and I'm happy to take people's questions if people have questions.
Well, first question, actually.
First of all, I think we need to give you a round.
Thank you, thank you.
I don't know about all of you, I'm blown away by everything I heard here today. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Marian.
You're welcome.
A gentleman who couldn't be with us today, some of you know him, Tony Galatsis, sent to me an email. And he wanted to know, what can you do to neutralize the assault on the public's ability to accept objective facts, because that's one of the things you talked about, and restore the public's ability to accept objective facts. And I think some of this would be with the COVID thing, with, you know, what is there anything your office can do, any programs? And I do think you're thing you talked about, the digital thing.
Digital
is a very interesting thing. Is there anything else?
I think the second piece, thank you for that. I think the second piece of it, and I have to say, I feel very differently, I think, than some others doing this work. I think there is a piece of that lack of acceptance which was our fault, and that goes to transparency. I think you pay us to do this work, and I think to the extent that we can be, obviously when we're looking for people, we can't tell you we're looking for them, but to the extent that we can be, being transparent about our work. So, for instance, you can go on our website, we publish all of the data in our office. So you can see what kinds of cases we prosecute, where we prosecute them, what the racial and ethnic diversity is of people as to the breakdown. Our diversion program, we have a very robust diversion program. You can go on and see who gets that diversion, who doesn't get the diversion. All of that is out there. I think around particular issues. For instance, when you have an officer-involved shooting, that sort of thing, we have moved that. We really are the only place in the state that has moved that decision-making out of our office and into the courtroom. We conduct an inquest. So a judge is making that assessment. When the judge is finished, we publish everything that we have in that case. We not only publish the judge's findings, we put out all of the video, the audios, the calls the police received, the police reports that people wrote. So you can go on our website and you can see every piece of evidence that the judge had. You may not agree with where the judge came out, but I do think that what helps to get people to objective fact is providing them with information. Because I feel really strongly that when there is no information, especially now, some kind of rumor fills that space. People don't do without information. They make up something, and then that becomes an urban myth. And then that's what everybody's reacting to. Because I think that's really true. You and I might disagree about something, but we should start from the same place of what is the actual objective fact.
I think that one of the things that at the beginning that really astonished me was the emergence of this idea of alternative facts, because it used to be that they were cold, hard, irreducible facts.
Right.
And now we have this new thing out there, which is alternative
Right.
facts. And can you just talk about how you can...
I think that's really true, and that's part of, I think that goes in part to, you will see, we work very hard, even when something happens, to put out as much information as we can right away, because you can't have your own facts. You may feel differently about the facts that happened, but there are certain things that happened. Either somebody responded or they didn't respond. This happened or it didn't happen. And we spend a lot of our time sort of fielding those questions where it's like that has, as I said, that incident earlier this week, what was out there just had no basis in reality. And, the only way you counter that is by saying when something has no basis in reality and also putting out what actually is the truth. I think it's very easy for people, and especially people who are suffering on their own, to just be someplace and spewing out different facts. And that's a piece of why we did the digital citizenship. Our business relies on facts. When we try a case, juries may feel differently about the facts, but everybody has to kind of put the same facts on the table. This is the evidence. Jurors can't go off and find their own theory or bring in their own story about what happened. One of the sacred duties of jurors is they are really bound only by the facts that are put before them during the course of the trial. So we really have to be, and that's, I think, one of the ways, as Eileen said in the beginning, how a DA's office has changed. We really do have to be the guardian of what are the actual facts that people are deciding on. And it's easy. I think Lewiston is a good example. I saw an article in the Globe yesterday, and this happens all the time. There always are, when events happen, and especially now where there's 24-hour media, there's a lot of false information in the beginning. And, this happened or that happened. And yesterday there was an article in the Globe that had a list of the things that had initially come out. I think there were 10 things, and only one of them was actually true. And part of that is just human nature. You got a lot of people running from one place to another. I will often get a call, for instance, we've had a murder, and it's a female victim. Well, I get there and it's not a male. Like, somehow somebody just told something wrong, and in the commotion, the way it got repeated, it's like that old children's game of telephone. The way it got repeated 12 times, it came. And that's going to happen, but it is on us at some point to then set the record straight. That's why when I do a press conference after an event, I try to give as much information as possible. I try to be very clear about that, and then I try to raise what I already know is out there as misinformation. To say, you might have heard this was a female. Well, it wasn't a female. Like, we can't keep talking about that because that's just not true. But I was interested to see that the Globe did that yesterday and how they only had a 10% accuracy rate as to what had been out there in the beginning. And I'm sure, as you saw it last week, I mean, at one point it was up to 30-something people were dead. You know, and that wasn't true. And at some point, you know, he had shot his brother. That wasn't true. And you know, you just have to kind of dismantle all of that. Yeah.
Don't you think it's a sort of cultural thing? I think I was brought up to trust and to become skeptical.
Yeah.
And now it's not even skeptical. It's almost believe it's not true until you prove it's true. So it's a really different generational thing, I think, for us, so that it's so bad.
I think that is true. You know, when I go out to talk about how to protect your identity and how not to fall victim, you know, one of the biggest scams, and it really just feeds on information, you probably all heard of it, is the grandparent scam. And that grandparent scam really depends on people having put some of their own information out there. Because they say all the time, if you only have grandchildren, if you only have granddaughters, and somebody calls and says your grandson's in trouble, well, you know enough to hang up. The people who get hooked into that get hooked into it because when somebody calls, they have a nugget of truth. You have a granddaughter who's at Columbia. That's why you pay attention. And I feel badly all the time because one of the things I say is that sort of instinct we all have, we probably all grew up with, of sitting and chatting and making conversation and, oh, you live in wherever my granddaughter goes to school there. We do have to pull back from a lot of that because unfortunately, and again, it goes to sort of those agents of chaos, there are people out there collecting that information who will use it against you, and that's unfortunate. It's the same thing as, you know, I spend a lot of my time now talking to people about never let people sort of breach your front door. Like once your front door is open, you're incredibly vulnerable. That's not what we want to be saying to people about if somebody comes to your door and says their car is broken down, but that is a reality of how we have to respond to people, and that's sad.
The other thing,
Yeah.
can I add on?
Sure.
Like, I won't watch, if it has a gun in it, I won't watch a television or a movie or anything. And just put a gun in it and it's out.
Right.
But
You must not watch much TV now.
Yeah, but how do you, because I think if, from the time you're born almost, you're seeing violence on anything.
Right.
And how do you change that when we can't even change a gun law?
I know, it's very difficult. And you know, I suppose there's the other side of it, right? I grew up watching Bonanza, but there were counterweights to that. I think we don't have a lot of those counterweights. And I think it's also the amount of time that people spend on their screens kind of in their own little world. I mean, that's a very different thing. You know, there's a difference between a family sitting down to watch Bonanza on Sunday night and kids who are spending endless hours just watching this crazy violence. You know, I do think that's a piece of when we see younger and younger kids committing these incredibly violent crimes. And there's a lot of new research about brain development and all of that, but you can see when you interview those kids, there is a missing piece of that I don't know that they grasp that the person's really dead, that this is over.
Oh, yeah.
You know, because there's such horrible violence, and it's like there's a disconnect of, I fired that gun, the person went down. I do think there's a link where it's kind of like, okay, now we'll move on to the next screen and we'll do the next piece. And that, I think we are aiming with the digital citizenship to do some of that. I think with getting personally involved with individual kids, you try to disrupt those pathways. But that is a bigger cultural piece. You're right.
think we have time for one more question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Are there any other questions?
I have a comment to give.
Can you, let's see if anyone else.
Can I say one thing? This was a wonderful program, and it's a small audience. LexMedia is here. They have recorded it. This will be available. Please tell your friends, other people in our community about it. Maybe we'll figure out some way that we can replay it in an evening time in one of our programs. But it's going to be out there, and it's going to be available. So, and are there any other questions?
Mine's a comment. Mental health. Any violence that we see anywhere seems to be the person has a mental health issue. 10% or less people that have a mental health issue are doing violent. So there should be a way we could separate that out, because now we've got all people that can shoot a gun, but 10%, but like they're going to be, we're all going to expect they have mental health issues.
So that's a perfect segue, because I said that exact thing this week when I testified on a bill we have now. We do need to be more discriminating against that. You know, the vast majority of people who have mental health issues are not violent. And the vast majority of people who have mental health issues will themselves be victims. But there are a category of people who have a mental health issue who are violent towards other people. And the system we have right now, and many of you remember we had the case this summer in Newton where the young man is alleged to have killed the couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, as well as the mother of one of those people. And that case, as well as many others, as well as Lewiston, illustrate a situation that we need to be in better control of, which is right now we rely on the families of those people, or sometimes the police, to say, based on whatever, I think that person is violent. And in Massachusetts right now, they file a Section 35, they go to court. If they are, based on whatever's happened, the judge believes that, he sends the individual off to a mental health facility for up to 72 hours. Sometimes that's 5 hours. And nobody's doing a really good assessment in 5 hours. And sometimes they spend the 72 hours in the emergency room, and we don't get much further. And then we let them back out again. And it's a real balance. Like, there's nothing more serious that we do than taking away somebody's liberty. But the bill that we filed would provide for 10 days of supervision. So if you choose to let them, they would have to stay the full 72 to get an assessment done. If you choose then, or the doctors choose to let them out, for the next week they would have to be under some supervision in the community. So they can go back home, but they've got to be under the supervision of a doctor, a social worker, or whatever. And the hospital, right now, if you get released, say you get released at hour 48, and you go back to the community, and you're fortunate enough to have support in the community, the hospital doesn't have to share with them what brought you there. So that social worker that's treating you is handcuffed because they don't have that information. So, you know, there are situations, it's like the employer, where people know things. We all knew that this person was rolling towards a bad outcome, and we didn't intervene to cause that not to happen. And this bill would be a step in that direction.
Unfortunately, they won't let us stay in this room past 11 o'clock because they have something else coming in, so we do have to leave. But I want to thank Marian so much. I couldn't. Just remind everyone that our next First Friday will be December 1st, which is a Friday, in this room. Michelle Ciccolo will be one of our guests, as well as the rest of our legislative delegation, Mike Barrett, Cindy Friedman, and Ken Gordon, and they will be discussing what's going on in the State House, bills, whatever they want to talk about is what we're going to do. So hope you all can come to that, 9:30, December 1st here. And thank you, Eileen, for arranging this, and thank you, Marian, for coming, and for all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.